And I'm sure that sometime over the last month or so, many of you watching took some time to look through the numbers and see how much it took to produce a pound of weaned calf last year. Nebraska Extension beef educator Dr. Berger joined me on the show to explain what the most recent figures tell us and advice for looking ahead.
As we look back at 2018, I think for cow-calf producers it was a fair year. From a production perspective, the spring of last year, there were some blizzard conditions that happened across the state that sure resulted in some greater calf loss than normal for some cow-calf producers. The summer was pretty good from a forage production standpoint across much of the state. We would have had above average precipitation, and that was I think a benefit in terms of the amount of grass we grew, but then a challenge to some folks in terms of getting that forage into a hay bale. As we look to the fall and winter, we saw some pretty good calf prices. I would say, in that $1.50 to $1.85 area. So, respectable in terms of cow-calf prices for calves, depending on where you were at in terms of if those calves were weaned or if they'd had a regiment of vaccine prior to the sale of those calves, really impacted whether you were on the lower end or upper end of that range.
And for unit cost of production numbers, what do you see here? Any idea where you see these going?
So from a cost of production perspective, I think I continue to see those holding steady or actually increasing. If you look historically, Livestock Market Information Center shows some annual cow costs. They've tracked it for 30 years. The last 15 years really started to see those annual cow costs ramp up. Across the United States, back in 2003, they estimated around $400 to $500 for annual cow costs. Today, somewhere in that $800 to $900. In Nebraska, if we look at cow costs from an economic perspective, meaning we include all cost, opportunity cost, labor, probably pushing close to that $900 to $1,000 per cow. Not every cow weans a calf, so we're over $1,000 per calf produced if we look at it from a strictly economic perspective.
And are there cost areas that producers can think about reducing this year or into the years ahead?
In my mind, there's really three big areas from a cow cost perspective. We're looking at feed costs being around 40 to 70% of annual cow costs. Next second big item would be labor and equipment. That one continues to present some challenges for us. And then the third one would be cow replacement cost or depreciation. I think really it's just knowing what your costs are, looking at each of these different segments, thinking about what the input is that you're putting into the production system, what's the value you're getting out. And then I think being opportunistic to think creatively around, is there some ways we can get more for what we put in, or are there some ways that we can cut some cost and not drastically impact production?
Gotcha. And what are some of the biggest questions that producers ask you regarding production costs? Do you have any advice for them?
I think some of the big challenges we see is looking at feed cost and just what's happening there. I've recently seen an increase specifically in distillers grains in Nebraska. That's a pretty major input for many cow-calf producers from a supplement standpoint, and so looking at alternatives. So I really encourage people to price things on a cost per unit of energy, cost per unit of protein, and what did it cost to get it into the cow. And so we're including all cost with waste in that. Putting a pencil to that, evaluating what your situation is, can help you make good decisions from a supplement standpoint.
Is there anything else you're keeping your eye on as it relates to the beef sector for the first quarter of 2019?
Well, I think we want to continue to keep an eye on what's happening in terms of our input costs. I think we're going to continue to see just some challenges there. And so being creative, thinking about specifically those areas I talked about, are there things we can do from a management perspective to leverage ourselves as we look at those? I think also just as cow-calf producers think about their own operations, what their skill sets are, what they think their competitive advantage is, and how can they further develop that in today's market environment.
And finally, what are some other resources out there that producers can take advantage of?
Well, I think just again, looking at the resources that are available at the beef.unl.edu website, a lot of good research-based information there that they can apply to their production system, thinking through, again, their management and just really putting a sharp pencil to how they think about what they do with their cow-calf enterprise.
And one more time, that website is beef.unl.edu. And remember, you can always reach out to your local extension office with any questions too. Next week, Aaron will be back on the show to talk about planning for calving season.